What's up, friends? This week I wanted to work on space in the mix, especially when I'm pitching tracks to vocalists. And I felt like one of the best places to take inspiration from was the producers of the late 90s and early 2000s. We're talking about Pharrell, Timbaland, Scott Storch, Dr. Dre, and the like. I've got a track for you today that's heavily inspired by Timbaland. Let's dive into it. There's a few things that a producer like Timbaland was doing in the early 2000s. And one of the first things that I pick up on is the groove, or what Timbaland calls the bounce. I've got a whole video on groove theory and creating that bounce, but this is what I have for this track. Notice how few kicks there are. We're keeping it very simple. And then with the snare, we've got one on the downbeat and one kind of pushed ahead of the next bar line. Now, normally for an anchor point in drums, we have a constant hi-hat. That gives us our tempo marking. And I think the brilliant thing about Timbaland's production is that the hi-hat is not the anchor point to the drums. It's just an embellishment. So what I've tried to do in this track is make sure that the finger snap and the shaker are our anchor points. And then, as I've just mentioned, after that, we're going to have our embellishments. These are things that are going to play once or twice within the grooves loop. And normally what we're going to do is fill these little points within the gaps of our current groove. Let's put that with the beat so you can hear it in context. I'm making sure that all these sounds are panned, EQ'd, and have a place in the mix. And that means that they don't sustain for too long, like the talking drum at the end of the groove here. Originally, that talking drum sounded like this. So the first thing that I'm doing is pitching it within the context of my other drums. And then I'm also using the Warp Beats forward transient option with the envelope set to 3. It's going to make sure that there's no sustain on those notes. Makes the sound a lot tighter, and it's going to sit within the context of your drums a little bit nicer. Make sure that your drums aren't too quantized. I'm using a lot of audio here, but you can see that some of my snares are playing just ahead of the bar line. And if you look on the right hand side here, you can see that some of my drums are delayed in milliseconds as well. This gives it quite a humanistic feel. If you look at a drummer's waveform, not everything is going to be quantized to the grid marking. So you can do that the same with one shots or your electronic drums as well to give it a more humanistic feel. For processing, I'm using the drum bus, a little bit of drive, a little bit of crunch, taking the damp down a little bit and taking the transients down a little bit. It's going to tighten up my drums and give them a little bit more of an attack. And then I'm adding a little bit of saturation, kind of that analog feel with the color limiter. Just a little bit of loudness, bringing that release down and the saturation up. It's going to give it that gravelly, warm tone. One of the brilliant things about Pharrell and Timbaland alike is that in the early 2000s, they weren't really taking whole samples. They were taking tiny little chops and pitching those around the arrangement. I mentioned Pharrell a couple of times in this video and would probably sound like this. I have really been enjoying crafting some early 2000s inspired tracks. Unfortunately, sometimes life can get in the way of that inspiration. As a musician and a producer, you know that your ideas never stop. But with the BandLab app, they don't have to. I can finish these tracks wherever I am. Here I've recorded just 3 quick notes of an ample sound guitar, and then I froze and flattened that in place so I could have it as a sample. From that sound to the sampler, I dialed in my ADSR settings, added OTT and EQ8 to tighten up the sound and bring out the highs. It's much more like a pluck sound now, and I started to play in a really simple melody. I tried not to make it too melodic, as that's only going to limit the vocalist that we pitched this song to. Timbaland makes really great use of some fantastic one-shot samples. There's so many great examples in Timbaland's discography, but check out Give It To Me, All Y'all, Promiscuous, Sexy Back. There's some really subtle things going on with the sample stabs. So I found this sample on Splice. And what I wanted to do is just turn that into a one-shot sample, just to embellish the melody that we already have, kind of double it up a little bit. If you add a delay and take that timing way down, add a line delay, it's going to make it nice and wide in the mix, but it's also going to give it this slapback feel like it's multi-track. Then I'm just adding the acoustic guitar to any gaps in that melody. This is in fact going to sit where the snare lands. One of the sounds that I heard time and time again in the early 2000s was just the sawtooth stab. Really basic sound, and I'm beefing up mine by setting my unison to 3 and just having a little bit of detune there. It's going to set the sound a little bit wider. You can notice that I've also got a little bit of a filter, so when that note plays, some of the highs are just ducked after the decay. And then we're adding the sub on direct out, and in the effects, distortion, and just a tiny pinch of chorus. And to make sure that that low end hits in a really nice way, I'm making sure that I've got a mono soft clip sine bass as well. And that just plays on those downbeats. At the end of the loop and going into the first downbeat, I just add a live bass slide to give it a more humanistic feel. At this point, we've pretty much got our beat. But once again, one of the elements that was really popular in the early 2000s was the use of the orchestra. This could be the string ensemble or brass. In this case, I've used both. This is pretty much only going to come at the halfway mark just to add a little bit of a dynamic lift back into that first downbeat again. So I'm using a combination of the built-in Ableton sounds and orchestral one-shots, which isn't dissimilar to what Timbaland would have been using in the early 2000s, maybe using the violin presets on a cheap keyboard and then sampling orchestral hits from a vinyl record. So I'm using both the tremolo strings and then the long legato strings, sampling an orchestra a little bit. Little bit of high-pass automation there. Here's our brass stabs. OTT, rolling off some of the highs. And then you may have noticed that I've got this Guzeng sample just rolling into the downbeat too. This on its own works great for a vocalist. But later on in the track, you might want to expand on those melodic ideas, maybe take out an element of the percussion section and add a more constant melody. This is where the obelisk bells come in. They play really quietly in the mix and they just kind of complement the main melody. This can be an element that isn't intended as an earworm. The listener's going to feel it rather than hum along to it. The same goes for a little vocal sample that we've added with just a manual delay. What I mean by that is just chopping the sample and turning it down manually rather than adding a quarter note delay. And in a true Timbaland fashion, I've just recorded some one-shots of my own, little shouts that I can sprinkle into the mix. Yeah, go. Ow. And I pepper these elements in just like I would with my percussion. So that's pretty much it for today's episode, guys. What did you think? Have your say in the comments below and keep me posted as to what you want to see in future videos. I've got a lot of exciting things coming your way, so make sure that you stay subscribed. If you want to download the stems from this project, then make sure that you head over to the Patreon where you can download both the stems and the frozen Ableton project to pick apart at your own leisure. It's been great seeing you again, and I look forward to catching you next time.